Okay, hi there, Epidemics. Hope everybody's doing well today. So I finally managed to get back on the North Shore computer system yesterday, but I decided that was a little bit too late to set up a quiz for this week. So there's no quiz this week. The journal entry that I did get posted before I started having all of these problems, that one is still due this Sunday before midnight. And then the project will be due before midnight on Sunday, May 1st. Any questions on this stuff? All right. So
I had a quick question. Where's the submission for the project? Is that like in week 14 or?
I thought I put a special content area that talked about the project. Do you not see that?
No, I'll take a look. Maybe I oversaw it. I'm sorry. I don't want to interrupt anymore. Okay. I'll chat you privately if I can't find it.
Okay. All right. So we started talking about biological weapons last time. Ooh. Okay, and so biological weapons include things like bioterrorism and biowarfare. And as I told you guys last time, it refers to the intentional release of viruses, bacteria, or other germs that can sicken or kill people, livestock, and crops. And that quote is the CDC's definition, which I thought was a pretty good one. Now, when we were talking about it, I mentioned, or I asked you guys, what's the difference between biowarfare and bioterrorism? Do you guys remember that?
One's paid for by the government, one isn't.
Yeah, biowarfare is basically government run. And bioterrorism is non-government. And it can be lots of different categories of people, individuals or groups. So this is the international symbol for biohazard, something that is biologically hazardous. So if you see something with that symbol on it, avoid it, unless it's a punk rock band's t-shirts. All right, so that's, go ahead and take a screenshot of that. So there's been a long history of both of these kinds of problems, biowarfare, bioterrorism. It can be very difficult to distinguish biological warfare from natural outbreaks of a disease. And a lot of this is because, you know, especially if it's government mandated, there's a lot of misinformation, as we call it these days, or stuff that is deliberately incorrect so as to hide who is guilty of it. Nate, go ahead.
Isn't the term for deliberate disinformation as opposed to misinformation?
Yeah,
'Cause
that's probably,
Information would be like something that was lacking context or like left out key points, where disinformation is not like deliberately stating something not true.
yeah, there's kind of a gray area in there though. Because you can deliberately spread misinformation. Is that disinformation? If you are spreading misinformation, where does it start becoming disinformation? How much do you have to know it's wrong? Or can you just be somebody's crazy uncle on Facebook who's not well educated and doesn't evaluate the sources of their information?
Yeah, talking about 5G towers and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah. When we talk historically, passage of time is also a concern. A lot of times the people responsible will try and hide the information. They'll try and claim that it was not deliberate. The first documented case happened in 1400 BCE. And a group called the Hittites, you may have heard of those if you spent a lot of time in church. They're mentioned in the Bible. They sent infected rams, so male sheep, to mix with their enemies' flocks. So they're deliberately trying to infect their enemy's food supply with a disease. We think the disease was tularemia, sometimes known as rabbit fever. In sheep, this causes fever, weakness, abscesses, and miscarriages. And it can cause death in 8 to 14 days, particularly in the young. It can also infect humans. So this is a tularemia abscess on a person's hand. So this was very commonly the kind of biowarfare that happened, especially before modern germ theory understanding. So they would use infected animals, cadavers or dead bodies. Sometimes they would dip arrows into decomposing animals, trying to get whatever killed the animal onto their arrow. They would also dip arrows into the saliva of rabid dogs. I don't want to be the person trying to not get bitten by the dog and get saliva on the arrow. And they like to dip arrows in basically decaying venomous snakes, because they knew snakes were venomous. Get the venom on the arrow. They didn't know what venom was. And they would make extracts from poisonous plants. So we talked about launching dead bodies over city walls when we talked about the plague. You guys remember the Mongols did that at Kaffa. The most recent case of using these cadavers was in 1710, when the Russians laid siege to the Swedish army in an area that is now Estonia. Same thing, they launched cadavers over the wall. Cadavers could also be dumped in wells, and dead animals could be dumped in wells to cause disease. We know that some groups would sell or give contaminated goods to the enemy. We talked about this with smallpox, when the British soldiers would give blankets from smallpox victims to the Native Americans. During the Confederate Rebellion, the war between the states, the Civil War, the Confederate public, in places where the Union Army had invaded, would sell clothing to the Union Army that they got from smallpox victims. Again, trying to, make the enemy sick. And another fun example, during a Spanish war with France, they added blood of leprosy patients to wine that they then sold to France. So there's a long history of this kind of stuff. All right, you want to take a screenshot of this?
That is so gross. So they drank the blood?
Yes,
Oh my God.
yes.
Take it was red wine then, right?
I'm sure it was red wine, yes.
But they sold the clothes, so they made profit off of death. So
Yeah.
Some
Yep.
dastardly folks, very dastardly.
Have you looked into the funeral industry, talking about making money off of death? Okay, so when we talk about biological weapons, the CDC kind of groups them into three major categories. Category A are diseases that have a high rate of mortality, so lots of people die from it. It's easy to spread. And we're talking about things like anthrax, plague, smallpox, tularemia, and a few other viruses. Category B, not quite as deadly and or doesn't spread as much. So salmonella species, E. coli strains that cause disease, cholera, those sorts of things. Notice these are largely digestive problems that can be spread through contaminated food, whereas the category A is largely respiratory. Nate, go ahead.
What is an alpha virus? Because I see there in the non-italicized text, alpha viruses family.
Yeah, that's a category of viruses. And honestly, I did not look up which viruses are in the alpha virus family. Filoviruses include things like Ebola. I don't remember what arenaviruses are. So that was my bad. I didn't look those up. I should have known you'd asked. Category C, this one is less defined. Multiple places have slightly different definition. These tend to be diseases that are newer pathogens that we don't understand well, genetically modified pathogens, and diseases that, for example, would be multi-drug resistant bacteria. We don't have a lot of information on. It's harder to develop them, harder to spread them. So when we talk about these categories, Category A is one that we have seen used sometimes. So anthrax. Anthrax is probably the most commonly used relatively modern bioweapon. It was used in World War I, World War II. The Soviet Union used it in 1979. It was released in Japan in 95, and in the US, which we're going to tell the story of a little later, in 2001. Botulism is also used. The botulism, we're specifically talking about the toxin, also known as Botox. That has been used to cause stomach problems, digestive problems in people. The Soviet bioweapons program used a hemorrhagic fever. A strain of Ebola, or at least they tried to develop it. Plague was used as recently as World War II. Tularemia was used in World War II, and smallpox, of course, has been used in the Americas. Nate, go ahead.
What about Zyklon B? Would that be considered a bioweapon? It's like cyanide gas. They used it in the Holocaust.
That probably would qualify more as a chemical weapon than a biological one. Sometimes the line between those does blur. For example, the sarin gas release in the Japanese subway system, that sarin gas would be considered a chemical weapon, but they also mixed in anthrax into the gas that they released. So it was both chemical and biological.
I think that sarin gas was used in Syria too a couple of years back with the Assad regime.
Yeah, he was using it on his own people.
Yeah. In the B category, cholera, typhus, which is another digestive disease, again used in World War II. Salmonella was used in World War II, and in the US in a bioterrorism incident in the 1990s, which we're also going to talk about. All right. So those are the major categories and some of the major specific diseases that have been used. So if you want that screenshot. This is the part that to me is the more disturbing section of this. So when we talk about biological warfare, using biological weapons as part of war, I am not covering what the Nazis did in the concentration camp in this section. That's pretty well known. It's talked about a lot in various history classes. I wanted to talk about some specific incidents that are less well known. And during the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 to 1945. Notice that this overlaps with World War II. Sino refers to China, so it's a war between China and Japan at the same time as World War II. And remember The US got involved fighting Japan in the Pacific during this same time period as well. There's a group called, or was a group called Unit 731, also known as the Army Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory in Japan, or it was a Japanese program. I should say they did a lot of their work in occupied areas of China. Nate, go ahead.
So just to clarify, this was a Japanese military unit. It
Yes.
wasn't, okay, I was just wondering because the numbers were just regular numbers, but that rising sun symbolism kind of keyed me in on Japan.
Yes,
Thank you.
it's a Japanese group. Okay. There's a lot of conflicting details about this, not surprisingly. So I'm going with the best that I could figure out. I looked at multiple sources to try and get the most accurate information. This was started in the 1930s, and despite the name, the goal was to develop biological weapons. That included production, testing, deployment methods, and figuring out storage. Deployment meaning how can we get this biological weapon to the enemy? If you're developing biological weapons, they used human subjects. They used prisoners, especially Chinese prisoners from the war. They used homeless people. They used the mentally ill and disabled. They infected them with various diseases to figure out the best way to infect and what the diseases would do to them. At least 10,000 people died as a result of these experiments. I warned you this was going to be disturbing. They tried to develop bombs to spread the pathogens. And they would drop those bombs on China. They were studying methods of infecting reservoirs and wells. And again, they were doing this, actively doing this in China. One of the things that they did when they were trying to, one of the diseases they were trying to use was plague. So they would drop plague-infected fleas onto China, as well as infected clothing, or, clothing with the plague virus in it, or bacteria in it, sorry. And they would drop infected food onto China.
So sorry, so like food's falling out the sky, like literally falling out the sky and people just eating it off the ground, like not knowing where it came from, like, oh, look at this, Jesus is raining food.
Well, a lot of times, at least sometimes during warfare, groups will drop crates of food into areas that are under siege and their food supply, normal food supply, has been disrupted. Sometimes it's charitable organizations, sometimes it's not.
And the people that get in it don't know where it's coming from, and they're just hungry, and they obviously indulge themselves.
Right.
Yeah, under the guise of like a care package, kind of, so that, like Professor said, they're like crates attached to parachutes that just drop into these war-torn areas, usually under like humanitarian aid or just general supplies.
Yeah.
So they're poisoning the citizens who are not even fighting them.
Yes.
Jesus.
Because they'll think that it'll spread to the war fighters eventually. So it's their collateral pretty much.
Yeah. This was relatively successful. The estimates that these weapons are that these weapons killed between 200,000 to 500,000 people. Specifically from the diseases. Japan has also been accused of using bioweapons at the same time against the Soviet Union, what is now Russia, and Mongolia. I've never really thought about Mongolia being part of the war, but I guess it was. And they had plans to do this against the United States. Julia, did you want to say something?
I just had a question.
Yeah.
With the war that's going on right now between Russia and Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
do you know of any acts of bioterrorism that have occurred, or is that just a big threat of it?
There is definitely a big threat of it. I don't know of any that has been confirmed, but it's very, very hard to tell. You can imagine the Soviet Union could, for example, release cholera or salmonella in the area.
Yeah.
And these are diseases that naturally become more common during this sort of situation, during warfare or times of major social upheaval or natural disasters. We can't tell. Nate.
Just to add to that, there is a looming threat. Because Ukraine has several biological research facilities with dangerous pathogens. Not saying they're for weaponized purposes, but they contain pathogens there. And if a Russian missile blows up half the laboratory and vials get released, I mean, whether it be intentional or inadvertently, you're talking about dangerous pathogens being released. So that's a very real possibility. And I know there's a lot of, I don't know, I think there's like 10 at least of those BSL 3 or 4 facilities in the Ukraine. So that's something else to bear in mind too.
Yeah. Yeah, people my age worry more about nuclear weapons, but we should be worried more about biological weapons.
I just hope he's already been allowed to do so much. I just hope someone actually does something before it gets to that point.
Yeah,
I don't understand why this is still going on.
Well, Putin is power hungry. It's all about his ego at this point.
That and the threat of nuclear weapons too, because they're really just like a big bargaining chip. And it kind of relates to nuclear deterrence theory that if I have this nuclear weapon and you screw with me, then it's like mutually assured destruction. Because if one nuke gets fired, then other nukes will get fired. And then they both will be destroyed. So no one wants to elevate to that step. So it's tough to get involved actively with Russia when they have these threats. And now I'm reading they're launching ICBM missile tests too. So they're kind of flexing their nuclear muscle, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so at the during World War II, the Japanese planned to use plague against the west coast of the United States. Specifically, they were going to start at San Diego. But 5 weeks before the attack was scheduled, Japan surrendered and World War II came to an end. So if it had ended a month and a half later, they would have tried to release plague in the United States. Now, the next disturbing step. the United States captured members of Unit 731. And these people were secretly given immunity from prosecution for war crimes in exchange for their data. So the United States government says, we want the information from your biological warfare program, and then you're free. You're not going to be punished for these crimes that you committed. Okay, screenshot. I told you this was disturbing.
Didn't they do the same thing with like Operation Paperclip with the German scientists too? I mean, I know it wasn't exactly the same, but same premise.
Yeah, they did similar stuff with German scientists, yes. So no matter what the government says, the US did have and possibly still has a biological weapons program. It began in 1943 during World War II, when both the Germans and the Japanese had their own biological weapons programs. And it officially ended in 1969. President Nixon ended the offensive aspects. What that means is that we're not going to try and make weapons we can use against other people, but we're going to study them so that we can figure out how to defend ourselves in case somebody else uses this. Now, worldwide, the Geneva Protocol in 1925 and the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, both of these treaties, international treaties, ban the use of biological weapons. And the US signed both in 1975. Now, it's pretty obvious that the US does not always follow the treaties that they signed internationally. This biological weapons program was secret, and the information we have is definitely incomplete, and some of it is probably wrong. The official policy was to deter the use of bioweapons and retaliate if biological weapons were used against us. But again, we need research on people. So who did the US government research on?
War criminals, maybe we had. Wow.
I'm spelling that one wrong. We know they researched on military personnel and other unwilling subjects or uninformed subjects. We don't have a lot of good information on who those people were. We know that there was testing done. That not using actual biological weapons, but testing to look at how bioweapons could be spread. There was a large-scale aerosol test in San Francisco. using a bacteria that doesn't cause disease in humans, but behaves similarly to anthrax to see how anthrax could be spread through aerosol. Yes, Nate.
Wasn't there an actual test where they spread like rhinovirus through an aerosol in a subway or something? It was the common cold or something like, I might be like missing information, but I thought I read something regarding that.
Yes, they did do a release, again, a bacteria that doesn't cause severe disease in humans. They released it in the New York City subway system. Has the US ever actually used a biological weapon?
Yes, right?
Maybe, probably, but
What about the A-bomb they dropped in Japan?
That's a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
There's two bombs actually, the fat man and the little boy.
yeah,
So
those
that's not biological?
no, that's nuclear.
Okay. I
It's
didn't know I thought it fell under the category.
No, nuclear is releasing radiation rather than disease. There are accusations that the US used biological weapons in the Korean War. There are also claims that
Was
the
it in Vietnam, the napalm drop? Like that stuff or no?
that's a chemical weapon.
Oh, okay.
I know it
Agent
can,
orange, but that's a chemical as well.
yeah, it can be tricky to tell the difference. There are also claims that the US deliberately contaminated food and livestock, specifically turkeys and pigs in Cuba in the 60s and 70s. These are accusations. We don't know for sure. But I don't know about you guys. I don't trust our government to tell us the truth about these. Okay, so that's the warfare part. So government funded, government run biowarfare. So screenshot this. We're going to talk about bioterrorism. Okay, so bioterrorism, we're talking about small groups or individuals. These attacks, most of the time, they either fail completely or only infect a few people. So there's not large scale mass killings that we can link to bioterrorism. Again, I'm going to focus on what's happened in the US. In the US, there have been people who, for example, deliberately infected others with HIV, including a dentist. There have been cases where bacteria that cause food poisoning were used to deliberately infect other people. And this can be people that are known to the terrorist or the perpetrator, or they can be random individuals. There have been two large scale, confirmed acts of bioterrorism in the US. And these are the two that we're going to spend most of our discussion about. So if you want a screenshot, now's a good time. So we're going to start with something that happened back in 1984 in Oregon. Between late August and October, in a very small community known as the Dales, 751 people got food poisoning. This was an incredibly small community, mostly rural, lots of farmers. 45 were hospitalized. All of them survived. So what the hell, right? This is a huge spike in food poisoning in a small community. So the initial investigation showed that salmonella had been spread on the food at salad bars in 4 local residents or 4 local restaurants. So they found the salmonella in all of these restaurants. The local residents, however, were more suspicious. I only have 2 things written here, so we're going to go ahead and on to the next page. It turns out that there was a cult in the area. This cult were followers of a man called Rajneesh, probably not pronouncing that well. This is our guy here. His followers purchased a ranch near the Dales in the early 1980s. And over the next few years, thousands of followers moved onto the ranch. So they were coming from all around the world to live on this ranch. This dramatic expansion of this cult and land use conflicts put the cult on bad terms with the locals. The locals were like, dude, this is a ranch. This is not a small town. You've got more people living here than we have in our small town. This is ridiculous. Specifically, they got into trouble with the county government, which issues building permits. And the county government says, no, you can't put more buildings on your grounds. So the cult said, well, if the county government is stopping us, we're going to take over the county government. And they decided to do this by doing 2 things. One was they were going to try and get seats on the county commission that issued building permits. And the other is they were going to try and get one of their members elected to sheriff. So they were trying to do this through the election process. And a lot of the cult followers were not American citizens. So they decided that they were going to ship in homeless people from elsewhere to vote in the election. So they literally would round up homeless people, bring them to Oregon, to this rural community, and try and register them to vote so they could vote in the election. Well, the county clerk knew something was up, and there was a regulation about, I think you had to have lived in the area for so long before they could be registered voters. And he said, no, you can't register. We're not going to register all these people. So that didn't work. So the cult leadership made a plan to prevent the residents of the area from voting on election day by making them sick with food poisoning. So the early tests, so they did build a facility to grow and prepare salmonella to be spread. Salmonella is pretty easy to grow as far as bacteria go. Their early tests had mixed results. They infected 2 county commissioners who were having a meeting with the cult about this building permit issues. They did infect those. They also tried contaminating produce, which did not work. And they tried contaminating surfaces, such as doorknobs, in towns or in buildings around town, especially the county courthouse. That didn't work very well either. So the salad bar issues were the test runs. They also wanted to, they also had plans to contaminate the water supply, plans to assassinate a United States, a federal government attorney who was, helping to block their building requests. So it wasn't just poisoning salad bars that they had plans for. The citizens of the community did not like the cult, and they knew that cult members were running for election, so they had some of the largest voter turnout ever. So they had a huge voter turnout to vote against the cult. Only 239 of the cult's members or the residents in this area were able to vote. Most of the 7,000 people living there were not US citizens. Which is why they were thinking, we'll poison the people. So investigators eventually moved into the ranch property, found the facility that was growing the salmonella. It had very specialized equipment in order to grow lots of it. And they also found several other types of poisons and potential chemical weapons on site. There was also evidence that the cult had experimented on people. Well, when the investigators moved in, the conspirators behind this fled. They fled the country. So several of them fled to Europe. The cult leader was forced to return to his native India. He wanted to go to Europe, but he was refused entry by 21 different countries. Rajneesh eventually resumed his teaching, and the group he formed in India is still in existence. It's a meditation resort. I don't know if it's a real meditation resort or if it's a resort or if it's still a cult, but it's still in existence. He has passed away since, but he lived lived to, moderately old age. Only 2 of the cult leaders who were involved in this were convicted on charges of attempted murder. The rest of them managed to escape justice. This was the single largest successful bioterrorism attack on US soil. Nate.
Did anyone actually die from the
Nope.
sound? Oh, thank God.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, the people they tested on might have died,
That is possible. I couldn't find good information on
but
that.
those willing participants, I presume, versus people that they targeted.
Well,
Unless
it's a
they
cult.
kidnapped people.
So willing
You're
is,
pretty much brainwashed at that point. So
Cheers. So was it that he was trying to avoid paying taxes? So you can build on your land, it's just under certain ordinances, but you got to pay taxes because you added more square footage. Was that the deal?
no, the county wouldn't let him build anymore. So you can
Period.
see all of these little houses that they built.
Yeah. Yeah.
The county said, you've got too many people living there, no more.
Imagine they focus that energy on something positive, because this is great if it was utilized for, positive purposes. Being a leader, having people come congregate together and join all their energies to produce something good. It's impressive, but then they veer it towards this foolery.
Yeah. Unfortunately, most of the time, when you get this kind of large numbers of people living together with a charismatic leader, it turns bad at some point.
What was it, Jim Jones? They drink that magic juice?
They drank the
Weird.
Kool-Aid, yes.
Jonestown, right?
Yep.
Weird, man.
All an echo chamber.
Yeah. Waco. I mean, it's just over and over. There are plenty of examples of cults that go bad. Yeah. All right. Screenshot. So the other major successful, I hate to use that word, but the other major successful bioterrorism attack was the 2001 anthrax letters. So shortly after 9/11 in 2001, during September and October, a series of letters were mailed from Princeton, New Jersey. So they actually were able to tell which mailbox was used to mail these letters, because they found anthrax all over the mailbox, on the inside and outside. And these letters went to a couple of US senators, Daschle and Patrick Leahy. Both were Democrats. And it went to several news organizations, including the New York Post and NBC News. All of the letters contained photocopies of handwritten notes. There's one of them here. Notice they used block print. It's hard to match block print handwriting to an individual. And you can see the kind of text they had, things like take penicillin now. Some of them mentioned anthrax specifically, death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great. Obviously playing up on the fears that the US had at this time period, because we had been attacked by Muslim, I'm just going to call them Muslim cult members, because they're not representative of that religion. And we were afraid that we were going to get more attacks. These letters resulted in 22 infections and 5 deaths. 2 of those deaths were postal workers. Just people carrying letters around. Now, not all of the cases had obvious sources of exposure. So some of these people who were infected, we don't know how they got infected, but it was the same strain of bacteria. We could do the genetic analysis and say it was absolutely from the same source. The US Post Office has since installed biohazard detection centers at major distribution centers, and mail going to Senate offices are subject to gamma radiation to kill any potential spores. Okay, so that's our background. So take a screenshot.
I remember this time, maybe, you know, majority of the class wasn't alive, but that was the scariest time of my whole life ever, I recall. And this is before we had the option to go paperless. You know, you can go paperless with everything. We didn't have those options. So it was like, I'm not paying my bills because I'm scared of anthrax.
Yeah, I remember it too. Yeah, it was.
I've learned about this. Wasn't like no one ever held responsible?
Yes. In fact, you're kind of giving a spoiler here.
Oh, sorry.
But we'll get there. You're right. Nobody has ever been charged with this one. All right. So anthrax, the most popular bioweapon bacteria. Why anthrax? So first off, anthrax is a bacteria. It has a case fatality rate for untreated individuals of 20 to 80%. So if you get anthrax and you don't get treatment, there's a very high risk of mortality. There's a huge range of case fatality rates there, right? 20 to 80%. It depends on how you get exposed. How did you catch that anthrax? It can infect through the skin. So skin contact, that's kind of the lower end of mortality rates. And it causes these large but painless ulcers. All this black, that's dead tissue. That's what we call necrotic tissue. Complete recovery can take months. So it's a slow recovery. Julia, go ahead.
I don't know. You probably heard of this show. It's on National Geographic and it's also on Hulu. It's called, I think it's Anthrax: The Hot Zone.
Okay.
And it's really good. It's about, I can't remember if it's about an actual event or if it's kind of just made up, but it's about like anthrax being released as biowarfare. So.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of that. That might be interesting.
Yeah, it's on Hulu.
Okay, that's good. Hulu's good. The inhalation form is the deadlier form. It can take 2 months for symptoms to show up. So that can be hard to track back to where you got exposed. And it causes similar symptoms to pneumonia. So shortness of breath, cough, chest pain. And this can cause death in 48 hours. So that's the kind that is most deadly. So if you're handling anthrax letters with your hands, you're not as likely to get a horrific, deadly disease. You still have a relatively high mortality, but it's not as risky. And these ulcers are pretty obviously anthrax. So you're much more likely to get treated because they're painless, which is unusual for this necrotic ulcer. Because inhalation looks like pneumonia or really bad flu, you're less likely for it to be diagnosed correctly, less likely to get treated. Okay. So anthrax occurs naturally in the soil. And it's found all over the place. And it can infect grazing animals. So sheep, goats, cattle, if you eat that infected meat, even if it's cooked, you can get anthrax. If you dig in this infected soil, you can get skin infections. There are around 2,000 cases worldwide annually, mostly in people who work with animals or their products, mostly outside of the United States. Fortunately, antibiotics work, and there is a vaccine. Now, if you work with animals, you might get the vaccine, but usually it's only given military. The vaccine is not great. The vaccine has a high rate of what are called adverse events or side effects. It requires multiple doses and annual boosters. So it's a crappy vaccine. But if there are only a few thousand cases worldwide, there's not a lot of motivation to create a better one. Now, anthrax can survive in the soil for decades, possibly centuries, because it does something called forming spores. And the anthrax spores, these are inert stage of the bacteria. So they're designed to withstand harsh conditions and long-term between infecting hosts. So anthrax has to infect an animal in order to reproduce and spread. Because it can stay in the soil in this spore form for long time periods, you know, if there's not a bunch of cattle in an area or sheep or deer, it can hang out there for a long period of time. Okay, but that also makes it a good biological weapon because you can form it into spores and spread them. All right, this is screenshot time. Now, we know that the strain of bacteria used in these anthrax letters were from the same source. So there was a single source. We know that. Finding the source of the letters was very, very difficult. There were several copycats at the same time who were sending letters claiming to have anthrax that didn't. A lot of those contained white powder that often turned out to be baby powder or powdered sugar?
Well, Professor, baby powder has been found to cause cancer. They have found some, I don't know if it's Johnson and Johnson's, I forget what it was. But
Yeah.
anyway, that's kind of a joke.
Yes. Yeah. I really hope that you don't find a powder and put it on the part of your body that it needs to go on to cause cancer, because it only causes cancer in certain places. Yeah. All right. All of this material was a strain known as the Ames strain, which had originally been isolated in 1981 from a cow in Texas. And it was spread to at least 16 bio research labs. Because anthrax infects livestock, we do need to study it. We need to learn about it. We need to figure out how to treat it in livestock like cows. One of the locations was USAMRIID. Nate, go ahead.
You mentioned that anthrax is derived from soil.
Yes.
Does it see, when I make these comparisons, I know they're not exactly the same, but is it kind of similar to how tetanus works, how that is soil derived too?
No.
But you could see where I got like the similarities from.
Yes, absolutely. Tetanus can, while you get tetanus from the soil, it doesn't form a spore the way anthrax does. And it has to get inside of your body to cause disease, which is why if you step on a rusty piece of metal, that is most likely to create the conditions where the tetanus bacteria can get into your bloodstream and cause the disease.
In addition to that, isn't spores typically a term used to refer to funguses, like fungal spores or something like that?
It's a very general term, yes. Yes.
Fungi would be the proper term, sorry.
That's all right. So USAMRIID, the United States Army Medical Institute of Infectious Disease at Fort Detrick, Maryland. And they have a BSL-4. In specific, the strain had several genetic mutations that allowed it to be tracked back to USAMRIID. What does that R stand for? Research Institute. There should be a research in there. Now, I'm going to put a little asterisk here. We're going to come back to that. So, there were several people who were investigated as potential sources of these letters. And of course, Al-Qaeda was investigated as a possible source. Most of the investigations were done by the FBI, some by the Department of Defense. And the FBI concluded that the letters were produced by a man named Dr. Bruce Edwards Ivins. This is a researcher from USAMRIID who had spent 20 years working on improving the anthrax vaccine. There was an idea going around that the Army was going to be scaling back the research, and Dr. Ivins released anthrax to try and restart the program. We got another asterisk here. So Dr. Ivins did have a history of mental health issues, and his therapists were concerned. They thought he might become homicidal or suicidal. when they raided his home, they found ammunition, they found a bulletproof vest, they didn't find guns, they didn't find anthrax or any laboratory equipment. Dr. Ivins repeatedly denied the accusations and eventually committed suicide by overdosing on Tylenol PM. I'm putting another asterisk there. Those asterisks mean that there is some question about these statements. Now, what are the problems with this? Dr. Ivins was not known to have skills to convert anthrax to an inhalable powder. Inhalable. That wasn't what he did. He worked on vaccines, which is a very different thing than making anthrax form spores that can then be ground down into an inhalable powder. We know that at least 419 people had access to that strain at USAMRIID. So there were lots of people who could get hold of that bacteria. Later investigations from outside the FBI state that the FBI overstated the strength of the genetic analysis linking the mailed anthrax to the USAMRIID supply. So that's a problem. And Ivins could not be placed at the Princeton mailbox where the letters were mailed. As I mentioned, the spores were not found at his home. And the spores were chemically treated by a chemical not found at USAMRIID. In addition to that, the facility at USAMRIID did not have the equipment set up for handling spores. So they didn't have the equipment to make the spores. They didn't have the equipment to contain the spores if they did make them. So if spores had been produced, they would have probably spread through the lab space. And there was no evidence of spores in the lab, and nobody at the lab contracted anthrax. So, in conclusion, the FBI has closed the case. There haven't been any mailings since October of 2001, knock on wood, and it's not clear from the outside if Dr. Ivins had anything to do with it or not. We're out of time, but does anybody have any questions or comments?
One thing, one lady got fired and threatened to mail anthrax, so they locked her up forever. Silly lady.
Yeah.
I want to say it was like 2018 or something, but there was like an anthrax letter scale to like some members of the Trump to members of the Trump family, and I'm pretty sure it came out of Beverly, where I live.
Oh, yes, I remember that. Those letters did not have anthrax,
Yeah, it was like baking soda or something.
Yeah. There have been a few false scares like that. Yeah. That guy was also mentally ill. I remember that one. Okay. If there's nothing else, good luck sleeping tonight. And have a good weekend. I will see everybody next week.
Thank you.
Thanks. Congrats again, Jerry. So happy for you, buddy.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
good
bro.
job, Jerry.
Thank you. Thank
And
you. guys.
Professor, I hope you enjoyed the journal prompt for this week. I left a very good review for you and your educational methods. So
Okay, thank you.
have yourself a good weekend. All right. And
All
take
right. Bye.